are familiar with human rights or development generally? Maybe a show of hands or nods. Okay, so we have some background, which is a great starting point. What I will get into with my talk is looking specifically at gender issues through a food lens, and the title, to translate French, is Mutual Assistance and Working Together. So we've already assumed that you guys have some background, but just generally with development, what I wanted to show here is how many actors we might have when we're looking at these questions. And so, we have states, which we've talked about in the previous presentations, but my presentation is abstracting back to the international institutions more generally. So what I'm arguing here is that we have a problem that comes from the lack of coordination amongst international human rights actors, such as the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and then, say, the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, which are the traditional development actors that we think of. So these lead to, the lack of coordination leads to various problems, and we do have some forced interactions. So depending on your familiarity, you might be aware of some of the most famous cases. Examples you can think of are the Uruguay pulp mills case, where it went all the way up to the International Court of Justice. So these are allegations of violations of, if you're using the human rights language, rights. If you're thinking just in strict terms of human dignity, you can say people were harmed by this. So my argument then is that we need to get to more coordination at the planning stage. And this is where part of my frustration comes from. We have cooperation going on in gender mainstreaming, women's empowerment, in food issues, food programs. So in the paper, I give many instances where we see this, and I would be happy to distribute that to you, but just blowing through right now to get to the main issues. When I was first writing this, there were as many political candidates as there are ways of framing this, so I'm not wedded to any of the terms, but this slide here I have because I want to remind everyone that we are talking also about private actors. And whereas in academic settings and in some of these institutions we think primarily about the public sphere, we're also looking at the agency of private companies. So to quickly lay out the differences in the actors and their aims, I just have a few different main points here that I would be happy to return to. But when you think about the starting point affecting the end game, these are hugely important formulations that have been decades in the making, so this will play out then. Now, when we think about what is the ideal of cooperation, gender mainstreaming in food issues is not this ideal, but it's a way of getting there. So to specifically lay out, we're talking about enhancing human dignity, more efficient allocation of resources, which were limited as we've acknowledged previously. And then we're talking about officials actually sitting down and talking together at the planning stages so that we can have coordinated execution of programs. So in the paper, I talk a little bit about how these human rights and development institutions have shared function or shared aims, and then they function in similar ways. And so, as we've said, most of the forced interaction comes at the execution review stage. But what I also want to highlight here with the data collection is the important work that we're doing with interviews and with looking at the case of trafficking and the historical analysis. Some development actors are very averse to using the more qualitative, contextual analysis. And so they will break life into various indicators that largely turn on GDP, broken down by population. And then we have the problem of human rights actors not being able to engage with numbers. And I'm guilty, I don't know about you guys, I don't like math, but we need to have more of both. And then we need to get into disaggregation as well. And there has been some success with that, with disaggregating on the basis of sex, but as we are all aware, there are problems with that. And so we can return to these questions as we look at the specifics here. So the Millennium Development Goals, everyone has heard of them, maybe? Okay, so we see that we have different goals for food and for gender. And this is important in that we're thinking about these as separate realms, and it's important to note that this is a development conception. So human rights advocates were lobbying for these goals, but what we're seeing with the Sustainable Development Goals, the next iteration, is a different game that's still, though, rooted in the development process. So again, we have gender equality and food being separate, and forgive me for moving so quickly, but I want to get to the meat of things. So different conceptions reflecting on the aims and actors slide here and how that plays out in food. Now, so what I'm looking at here is why we have agreement between these actors who really struggle to coordinate on other issue areas in women's issues or gender mainstreaming. And we do have this parlance that is flashed about on screens, and people talk about the empirically demonstrable efficacy. So in the paper, I identify, this is just one way of going about it, but a few different reasons why we might conjecture that this agreement has come about. So with one, I'm basically talking about the international women's movement. So I don't know if any of you have heard of AWID, but there are big groups that essentially aggregate women's organizations at the international level to be able to lobby for the SDGs, the MDGs, and in other spaces such as the UN forums. And that has had a huge impact. With two, when we're talking about implementation by interested parties, I mean that the World Bank has had to hire more women. And actually at the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, it's a bit of a joke how there are no men and it's all women, which we can imagine drives implementation of women's concerns in programs and advocacy strategies. So with numbers, with food, the case is so clear-cut, it's almost dumbfounding how people didn't get to looking at women's empowerment in these programs previously, but in some regions we're seeing up to 75% or 80% of food production is driven by women, and yet then there are structural impediments to these women being empowered to say, I want to make decisions about land because they don't have rights, for instance, for owning that land or for allocating food and resources that they do have control over. So with implementation costs and benefits, I actually want to compare this to what I have alluded to previously with the Uruguay Mills case, where indigenous populations concerns might be much more polemic, for instance, than women's empowerment, because there are ways in which indigenous people's rights are anathema to development land grabs, for instance. On the other hand, if you acknowledge that women are doing 75% of the work, then it is clear and there are low or acceptable implementation costs to incorporating these concerns. And then with results, it was just such a clear-cut case that empowering women raised the production of food and made families better off, that actors incorporated these. So in the paper, I get more into the specific language that all of these different institutions have used that really does show the cross-pollination between the actors of the development concerns, qualitatively, quantitatively, and the human rights actors with incorporating development concerns. So these are just some of the titles to show you, and maybe actually to back up quickly. So with vulnerable women, for instance, this is a token human rights categorization of the vulnerable populations, and this is the title from a development report. So we have seen coming together on women's empowerment in food issues. Now, obviously, there are a number of challenges to taking this as a real success and then moving into other issue areas, and even, I mean, we still need to make so much progress with gender and women's rights, and the recent Committee on the Status of Women demonstrates that. So we can talk more about what needs to happen moving forward, but I do want to save time for questions. And so just some considerations. I don't know if this has made sense at all, but hopefully we'll have some points to talk about at the end, and I would be happy to discuss all of this more at length, so if you have questions or like paper, please feel free to email me. Thank you.